Good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me. It's Eileen Cook and it is Wednesday, July 17th. So it is good to see everybody here today. I have some things to discuss, but Alyssa, I was wondering if you wanted to go over your query letter, yay or nay. Do you have it with you handy? Okay, I'm going to give you the ability to share that screen. So hang on one second. So I think most people know that Alyssa is working on a YA sort of, not really fantasy, but set sort of in the Amazon period. And so she has got a shiny new query that we're going to take a look at. And then after that, we're going to have the fun of talking about rejection, which seems sort of perfect after talking about queries. So sorry about that, but it's just a good plan for all the things.
So, sorry, where do I, share, is it under share?
Yep. If you hit share, it'll show you a screen option, and then you hit, basically, does that look familiar?
Success?
Success. We can. Okay. All right, so everyone just take a second and read this one out. Now, this is your second version. Is that correct, Elise?
Second version, 20th version.
Somewhere in there. Hard to say.
This is the second time we've looked at it in office hours.
Okay.
And it actually isn't all that different than the last version in office hours.
All right. Does anyone have any thoughts on this before I weigh in? Oh, people are still reading. I read too fast. So Alyssa, what were the big changes that you made for this version?
Basically just, so the first version, it was more focused on the lion and sort of like kind of the inciting incident. And this one I tried to give it sort of a bit more of, okay, this is where it starts and then this is where how it arcs. So a bit more of a sense of the story.
Tracy, were you in that office hours? I think you were.
Yeah, I believe I was. I kind of like how, like you said, I noticed there was a little bit of background, but not too much background on the girls. You already get a sense that they're, like right away, you know that they're not on the same wavelength. Like they're definitely fighting each other without, having to say very much. They say really well. And like you said, you mentioned the inciting incident super quick, which is great, and kind of gets me, oh, that's what happened. Interesting. Okay, and then you kind of want to know what's going to happen. So I like that you have both the background of the two role characters and then what causes the whole thing to kind of steamroll and start going, the story start going. So.
And then I'm curious for people who haven't seen this query before, is there anything that sticks out for you, either positive or negative?
I think Cynthia had some comments before.
Well, Christy has one. She's doing her finger waggle.
It sounds really awesome, Alyssa. I guess just sort of off the bat, though, I'm just kind of wondering, oh my God, is this sounding kind of like a Hunger Games?
That's interesting.
Yeah, and not that there's anything wrong with that even, because it's awesome. But I wonder, because that's still so in the minds of readers and moviegoers even now, I wonder if you face something like that head on? And this is kind of a question for everybody. When you know that, okay, there's, young women in battle who do archery, who do all these different things. I don't think I would be alone in linking it to something like Hunger Games. So do you then hit that directly on the point in a letter like this to say this is, a cross between Hunger Games and, whatever? Or do you say this is unlike Hunger Games? Because to me, in a way, like, should you not be addressing a familiarity to something that is still so within our...
It'll be interesting. I'll have people put in the chat window their thoughts, because the Hunger Games never came into my head.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Just because of it not being dystopian and sort of that end of the world alternate kind of, like, there is the archery connection and the need to sort of getting along would be interesting. So Cynthia, you were having a hard time. See, I can unmute you, sweetheart. Wait. No, apparently I can't.
So just a comment on the Hunger Games thing, sorry, before we jump on. I have had other people make comments about, oh, so Garrus is like Katniss, I like that. But I guess I'd always thought that, like, you don't want to be like, oh yeah, this is the next Hunger Games.
Yeah, no, avoid saying,
I know that's
yes.
definitely a no.
Yeah. That's a no. Do not say that. But you could potentially use it as one of the comps. But strong heroine fighters such as Katniss in the Hunger Games, something like that. You should be open now, Cynthia.
Okay, super, thank you. Oh, I can see the reflection of your little dog move in the table behind you, Eileen. Sorry.
Hang on, I'm going to pick this.
It was a distraction. I'm excited that you have finished this novel. I understand that you're moving to the query stage. That's really awesome. One thing I just thought right out of the shoot was that the first sentence, I think, could be a bit a better grab, or a better sort of spark to really grab somebody's attention. I didn't really feel that from the beginning, so I would just throw that out for your consideration. And I didn't have a sense of really, in a nutshell, the time that you talk about the Amazon, but is this a futuristic? Does it have futuristic elements, or is it just all historical? That sort of thing I think would be of interest right up front too, rather than having to read through the whole letter. I think to have some little things that the reader could grab just right in the first sentence or two, that they go, oh yeah, I really want to read the rest of this. So that's my 2 cents.
And this may be, go ahead.
That's actually my worry about this, is that it's not grabby enough. Like, that's, I think, my main concern. I'm like, well, if I just read it too many times and now I'm bored with it, or is it a little dull?
And
so if anyone has any
suggestions, you're like, please. I think what is interesting is, for me, and of course this kind of comes down to, I think, preference. I like that opening line. And for me, it's because it gives me so much, that it's a historical action adventure, that they're sisters, and that they have to combine their strengths to get their freedom. And like, to me, it's getting, I know that they want to return home. I know that they're sisters. They've got to figure out how to work together. So for me, that really works. So I quite like that one. Marianne, did you want to talk a little bit? You've had a couple interesting comments in the chat, so I wanted to pull those out.
Just reacting to things other people are saying. I never thought, in all the conversations we've had about your story, Alyssa, I'd never thought about Hunger Games, but when Cynthia mentioned it, I'm kind of like, well, yeah, kind of. But not just in this case, but in all sorts of other cases. I think readers go to sort of fantastical historical settings and situations in order to capture some of the same things, the danger, the adventure, maybe the unconventional roles, the battles, that they go to dystopian futuristic stories. Like there's a similar appeal. So if you wanted to spin it that way, I don't think that would do it any harm. As long as you kind of understood that it's not a dystopian future story. It's a like, and the other thing I don't understand is, are you basing this on real Amazon history, not fantasy Amazon history?
Correct. Yeah. So it's based on archaeological evidence that shows that this is a society where men and women both fought in battle. But the Greeks heard stories and they interpreted it as all female bands of man-hating warriors. So,
you don't actually tell anyone that, because that's very unusual to do that research and to tell a story based on to me that's hooky from the uniqueness of the story perspective. And I guess I'd want to know that, because there's so much fantasy written about Amazons that you need to, I would anyway, differentiate yourself from that somehow.
That might be an interesting thing. I'm looking at the paragraph. You do have it. The novel was inspired by archaeological discoveries.
Down there.
Yeah.
But that could be spun in a much catchier way, rather than just sort of backup information. But something like Amazon warriors have captured the imagination of readers for centuries. Something about what is the truth behind the myth, or how it's, I don't know, something like that, and sell it a little bit, like the fact that there was danger and adventure and skilled warriors and all this stuff underlying that mythology, and that's what this story is. I mean, without getting it too explaining, because that's what I do. But anyway,
yeah, no, that's really helpful.
You know what I meant? Like, just like,
that's why I love this story. But then when it comes to the query, it's like, oh, focus on the character, focus on the story, right?
Well.
So, and I mean, I'm going to highlight too, because I think one of the reasons that I think we're going to pull into doing query letters in the office hours here is you are going to get such different opinions from different people. So in some way, it is going to come down to what hits for you and what makes you feel like it best represents your story. So one of the things I have seen people do is create a list where they have kind of two columns. And so the first column is how their book is maybe similar or has, things that, and then what might make their story unique or different. And trying to see how they can blend those two things together to sort of help them with the query, because you're trying to look for both of those points. You don't want your book to sound like so much of an outlier that no one knows where it's going to go or where it's going to fit. That's why I do like that you have the comparables in there. It gives the person kind of an idea of where to target it. Bonnie, did you have a thought? You have to say it out loud, though. There you go.
Really, because I've seen this query lots, so I'm influenced by all my knowledge. But yeah, I thought I kind of wrote she could maybe spin the archaeology portion a bit better, make it more evident that it's about women and men who fought as equals. But other than that, it sounds great. Sounds great, Alyssa.
I mean, I want to say that the big things that stick out to me is I think this is a big step up from the earlier query that we saw, because the earlier query was all the setup. And I felt like, we had a whole paragraph that got us to where the story starts, which is after the lion attack. So this to me feels much more balanced and also brings in more emotion, which was something that I think was also missing in that initial one. We didn't really have a sense of how the sisters felt about each other. So some things that I really like and I want to pull out for other people to sort of highlight is also some of the word choices. So for example, there's the lion is stalking their horse herd. That's a really good one. Stripped of weapons and horses, things like that. There's some really good verb choices in here that I think is really getting you a lot more bang for your buck on the real estate. So that's something I want to encourage other people to look at too. And it's a good thing for you to go through as well, Alyssa, and just take a look again. are you always using the best word for things? I do want to point out again, another thing that I really like is we have armed with her mother's battle axe. So one thing I like about that is, did you see Cynthia's face on that one? She was giving you a like, yeah. Is you're praying, and that also her mother was in that. So I know that was one of the things that you really wanted to get in there, that she comes from a long line of fighting Amazonian women. And I think that gets that into that in a very nice way. And it gets in that she's confident that this is her role, and that her younger sister is intellect versus brute force. So you can sort of see the conflict that's going to come up between the two sisters without having to highlight and say, by the way, the two sisters didn't get along because of this particular thing. Then you take us right into the inciting incident, and then we have the basic thing. So I'm wondering, even like, you have in the line, they're sold into slavery in the patriarchal ancient Athens. That might be a place where you might be able to put a line like, which is so different from their own society, or like that might be a place you can put in a little bit of that balance. But I think that you have the nice conflict of what they need to do. And I like the line as well. I want to highlight for people, Sagaris must trust her sister and accept that strength comes in many different forms. That's another one that I really wanted to highlight, because I think that is basically the theme of the book. I'm pretty certain that's where we're going with that one. Other thoughts on this?
Okay, I'll stop typing.
All right, Bunny, go for it.
You could add a year into the line where you say they were sold into slavery, just because in historical fiction they often like to know what time period you're discussing, and that it would be a place where you could just slip that in. Sold into slavery in 1700 patriarchal ancient Athens, something like that.
And that may help too when Marianne was talking about people wondering if it's fantasy or not. If you have something that grounds it, again, in sort of some real historical things, that may help you out with that as well. Any specific questions that you have, Alyssa?
Yeah, I guess I just kind of wanted to hear if people were, yeah, I think what Marianne said about putting that in, like that's kind of where my passion with this lies, and maybe by crafting an extra sentence or two like that, I could add a bit more passion to it, I guess. Because yeah, it feels like I'm telling all the things, but I don't know. I don't feel like it sings. I don't know.
You could put one really hooky sentence even before the sort of conventional "in stronger together as 60,000," like grab, then define, and then explain a little bit more. That it's stronger to, like, that's very often the case, isn't it, Eileen, in queries, that you sort of hook them first and then lead into the title and the word count and the genre?
I've seen it both ways,
yeah.
And I've seen it work both ways, which is always the challenge.
But that standard format, it's in order to get all those pieces in, it's never the most exciting sentence.
I mean, I think the one thing would be interesting for you to do, and maybe for everyone else, because you're such a long way into this journey, is write yourself a page or so about why you got excited about this book. Like, what made you spend the past 2, 3, 4 is good too, 4 years on this novel. Like something kept you going and intrigued with it, and you know, kind of write that down, like why you loved it and why you got so passionate about that. And that may be something almost that comes in. You have the paragraph, I'm an active member in the online writing group, the Create Academy, I test writing conferences. Like if you end up needing space, like I almost would lean towards putting in a line of something around, like with a passionate interest in that, like, you know, years of research, like whatever it was that kind of inspired you. And I'm thinking you're a little bit or tweaking off Bonnie's line that has that line, like, I'm an ardent believer in dragons. What's the line, Bonnie? Help me out. but she's going for dragon.
I totally believe that dragons exist and they will return, and I will help them. I will save them from extinction. That sort of thing.
That was it. So something that I think really kind of just hits and really goes for kind of what, you know, her personal passion is in that story. And I think that makes a big difference.
That would go a lot further than that you left your geophysicist job. And like, I don't think you need to explain any of that in a query.
Like, I think it's always that paragraph. I think it's always interesting and has, you know, people always kind of want to know who you are. But if I had to choose in the tight real estate space, I would take out the career in geophysicism and where you're living if it gives you a chance to do more of that on there.
And maybe replace it with, you know, or partially replace it with to pursue your passion for storytelling, you know, because I don't think that necessarily helps.
Years of, you know, research in this topic, blah, you know.
Yeah, usually they say that what else you do besides having written this book is not relevant unless it's particularly applicable, you know, in terms of research or training or experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting job, and that's one of the things that I sort of like, that you have that in there. But I think if I was looking for bigger bang for the buck, I would go for your passion for it. All right. I will have you turn off your screen share, Alyssa, unless you want to leave your query up there, which you can do. And what I wanted to go to is to actually sort of talk about, oddly enough, dealing with rejection. So I thought what would be useful is to talk about typically the kind of responses that you're going to get from an agent, and then sort of kind of what you do with those different responses, and then some sort of tips. And people should feel free to chime in as needed, because I know people have had their own experiences on this journey. And this is dealing with agents in particular, but of course it's also still very relevant if you are potentially dealing with editors directly. So I think it's useful in that sense. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is like when you get absolutely no response at all. So you send off the query and you don't hear a thing. This is certainly my least favorite thing, and it didn't used to be the way. Now, again, I'm old. So when I was sending out queries, we did it by mail. And if it makes you feel any better, you had to include a self-addressed stamped envelope. So you paid for the stamp for them to send back the thing that they didn't like you. But the upside of that was at least they typically did that. So that is one thing, but you may get a no response at all. So one of the things I would say is take a look in that to see whether or not they have any kind of track record. Like, is this something like if you go on the Absolute Right website, a lot of people are talking about like which agents, and some agents will actually even list on their submission guidelines that a no response is a response. So you will see some people, like if that's what it says and they have a typical, like you can expect to hear on queries within 2 to 3 months. And if you haven't heard and they say that they do new response, then you can do it. I typically don't put, like some people will put in a query letter. You know how you can send an email where it says, please, like you basically click a button that proves that they've gotten it. So some people are like, should I send emails with proof of, being received? I would not do that. I think agents find it irritating and annoying. You can potentially follow up and send an email and be like, I queried you on X and X date. I noticed your submission guidelines say X, and then resubmit. But in general, most of the time I tell people no response, typically just move on. Alyssa.
A lot of agents now have like an auto response, like we received your query, and often the auto response only works if you have query in the title or in the subject of the email. And so some of them will say like, make sure you put query in the subject of the email. And then, you get an auto response, basically. We've received it. And then sometimes it'll give a timeline, and sometimes it won't. Like sometimes it'll say expect a response within 4 weeks. If you don't hear within 4 weeks, it's a no.
Yeah. And this is another time which, can't be hit often enough, is make sure you are actually following guidelines. So if they tell you to put query in the subject line, make sure you are putting query in the subject line. You definitely want to look like someone who follows the rules or takes some guidance. If it doesn't say, I do think that's a really good point. When I was sending out queries, I would always do query, rom-com, unpredictable, like so that if they were doing a quick search that they could find it. The other thing, which isn't really related to here, but if you are at any point asked to send in a full, make sure that you have a footer with your name and your email on it, because the manuscript may get put out separately, or make sure it's in the subject, like someone could find it. So if your manuscript is at some point is an attachment, that they can actually find you. I can tell you I've actually done that a couple of times where I've gotten papers from students where they submit it and it doesn't, and if I don't save it as that particular thing, then I have to remember who was working on that particular story. Now, someone like Bonnie, who I've read lots and lots of her pages before, if I start reading about, dragons or whatever, I'll be like, yes, this is Bonnie's story that I'm reading. But an agent who's certainly going to have piles and piles and piles of paperwork probably isn't. So take a look at that. And, I like this. Leslie has an article on Medium, which is perfect. I should have stolen from you, Leslie, on how to interpret agent responses. So I don't know if people see that in the chat window, but be sure to grab that. Second thing that you're likely to get is kind of an automatic rejection, where you can sort of tell after a while you get familiar with sort of what the language is, but it tends to say something like, thank you so much for your submission, which we read with interest. However, at this time, it's not a good fit for me or my agency. As you know, this is a subjective business. You can expect something like that, and they usually wish you the best. This is not a time that you want to go back and explain to them why they missed how your story is truly extra special and that they should read it again. You're not going to be able to do anything with that. So if you have gotten an automatic rejection, you can acknowledge that it sucks, because it really does, and it's certainly no fun to get that rejection, but stack it up. You get to consider yourself proud of at least having sent out your work, and move on to it and move on to the next agent. If you're looking at a bunch of agents in the same agency, again, read their guidelines, because sometimes there is a thing that will say, basically, if you submit to one agent in this agency, you've submitted to all agents in this agency. So if that has happened, don't keep sending on to someone else. So the next thing you're going to get is some kind of personalized rejection. So something that says, I really like the story, but there's something personal that lets you know that they've read it. Like, I really loved the character of Sagaris. She, struck me as a super bright and, strong woman, and I really like that about her. Then you want to, one, revel in that, but unless they're saying like specific notes, like please consider or revise and resubmit, then it's still a no. But hang on to those, because those are also, if at some point you decide to not go forward with that story, you may requery the same agent. And so it's clearly someone who liked your work enough to send you back a personal note. It's not necessarily a thing that they are going to go into you with like the song long back and forth. Like, I know some people are like, will write back and be like, can you tell me more about what didn't work for you? Or can you, help me understand how I can make it better? The truth of the matter is, and it's just a reminder of how the business works, they don't get paid for any of that. So helping you with your manuscript that they're not taking out is not something that they're paid to do. So they're very unlikely to do it. The fact that they wrote you a personalized rejection letter should make you warm and fuzzy, because that was something they were doing on their own time. They saw something in your work that they wanted to highlight. So certainly enjoy that. And the next thing you're likely to see, hopefully, is a request for a partial or a full. And those are definitely worth celebrating. Enjoy those, all those kinds of things. And then what you're going to want to do is basically send it out to them. So this is why you're often encouraged not to be querying if you're not actually ready to send the book, because if they are excited, you want to send it to them while they are still excited. So the sooner you can kind of return that, the better. Send them only what they're asking for. So if they're only wanting 3 chapters, then you send them 3 chapters. You don't say like, here's what not to do. And then hopefully what you're going to do is from there hear positive news. And so typically what you will get if it's positive news is they will send you back an email and say, is there a time that we could talk? It's very rarely they will set up a phone call with you unless it's either they're calling to operate basically and offer you what they're going to do, or they have some really serious notes about revise and submit, that kind of thing. And I'm just also going to highlight for people, there's some really good suggestions in the chat window if people aren't watching that. But basically, yeah, if you have requested materials so that you're not getting lost in their email thing, I would put, full request and those kind of things. You're basically always looking to make it easy for them to find you and to follow up with you. I don't know if anyone remembers, I think it was Janet Reed who, at that time I think was with Fine Print, but she read a manuscript and the person, it had gotten separated from the email that it came from, and the person had no phone number, no email on their manuscript. So she had a name, but she didn't know where the person was from, and it wasn't a name that was, particularly like it was a name that would be, Jane Cook or something like that, where you're not going to just necessarily find that person by Googling that. And so she basically was so gung-ho on this manuscript. She was posting on other agents' websites and also on public. Like if anyone knows a Jane Cook who wrote a story about an Amazon warrior sisters, please have her reach out to me. And eventually they did connect and she offered that person representation and they sold the book and it was all kinds of things. But I would not count on an agent going above and beyond in that kind of way that they're going to particularly hunt you down. So please make it easy for them to find you. And the last thing I wanted to say on kind of that agent part of things is that you don't want to burn any bridges. And I know that there may be times where you feel like someone didn't give you serious consideration, or you feel that maybe what they said was flip, or maybe you've just had one rejection too many and you feel like you want to snap. It's a lot smaller business than you think it is. So you don't want to be that person. You don't want to be sending an email that's going to be around their coffee talk. Like you wouldn't believe the response I got today from this writer, because they do talk and they do remember each other, and you don't want to be that person who might be just a little bit on the unstable side, because the truth of the matter is most of us writers are just a tiny bit unstable. So that is something to keep in mind, that they are screening for that as well in terms of a work process. So Christy put in the chat window, can you talk about multiple submissions? I don't think you need to disclose it. I think most agents are making the assumption that you are on a multiple submission. And in fact, I would not do an exclusive submission except within a few very tiny parameters. So if an agent said to me, say I met someone at the Surrey conference and they said to me, I love this, will you give me an exclusive? I would say I will. If it was an agent I particularly was passionate about working with, I will, but I would put a time frame on it. I will give this to you for 1 month. And that's it. Because otherwise it can take agents months to get through things. And that's months that you're putting your career on the side burner, and that is not in your best interest. And so, no, sorry, I won't give a submission as a single one. Alyssa?
Some agents will say only submit to one agent at the agency at a time. And sometimes they'll also say, if you've received a no from an agent at this agency, there'll be others. So sometimes it's like, if you receive a no, then that's a no from everyone. Sometimes if it's you receive a no, then you're free to query the next person. And sometimes it's you're free to query the next, but please let them know that this person passed.
Yeah.
But yeah, the
always follow
directions
directions.
On the agency website.
Yeah. And if it's not on the website, then I would feel free to submit to the next one and within an agency. So I would make the assumption, unless they are saying, submitting to one agent here is like submitting to all, I would make the assumption that that was it. I would not submit to multiple agents within the same agency at the same time. So if we were an agency, I wouldn't submit to Christy, Marianne, and Leslie all at the same time. I would choose who is my top choice. I'm going to pick Leslie this time around, so she's my dream agent. So I would submit to her first. And often when they say or have something in there that where it says, a submission to this agent is a submission to all the agents, that is because they are talking to one another, and it's often an agency where they're having regular meetings, whether that's online like this or whether that's actually in the office, where they'll bring queries and they're sort of knowing. So they're talking to each other. So they know that Christy's really looking for a dragon fantasy, and that Marianne is really looking for an Amazon historical story, and Leslie's looking for science fiction. So if Tracy is an agent who loves romance, got a historical thing, she will, kind of pass on to another agents within the agency, because they do know sort of what another person is looking for. You will also sometimes see agents will email back, and so they will say something like, this really isn't my cup of tea, but I do know it's of interest to someone else in my agency. Would it be possible for me to send that on? And of course, most of the time, unless you have a big issue with that, there it is. So Cynthia has the question, having an issue with the gatekeeper, which is annoying, which is there may be an intern who is going through the query pile and making that decision. The only thing I can say is sometimes an intern will give your work more consideration than the agent might, just because they are desperately trying to do a good job. So they are much more likely to be reading very slowly and carefully, because the last thing that they want to hear is that they passed up on something that became the next Hunger Games or something like that. So they tend to be reading much more closely and carefully sometimes than an agent might. So that is the upside. The downside, of course, is you've tailored your query letter to an agent who may not be the one reading it. I would say a lot of agents are still reading their own pile, and partly because they have that same itchy trigger finger too, that they're afraid they're going to miss something if they're not the ones sort of going through it. So I want to talk also just about some important coping strategies or things to keep in mind, because it can be a long haul. So 2 is to decide whether or not you need to take a break. And I think sometimes we go against ourselves and we sort of put ourselves down, but it is okay if you need to step away from the keyboard for a period of time, whether that's in writing, so you just reach a wall with your book and you need a little bit of time off, but certainly in the query process, if it's starting to become where you're feeling just really discouraged and it's turned from, oh, they didn't like my book, to nobody likes my writing, I'm a horrible writer, I'm a horrible person. Once it starts to become that more global stuff, that might be a time where you need to just hit pause on query. I would encourage you to sort of put it in the calendar about when you want to get back to it, because you can suddenly find that a long time has gone by. So decide if you want to put in your calendar and diarize, like, I'm going to give myself, the rest of July and August off. And when it's back to school time, I'm going to start hitting the query button again and go ahead and do that. One of the hard things to realize, which is in life in general and not just with querying, is that you cannot control everything. Yeah, who knew? How many people in this room have struggled with anxiety at some point? Okay, that was pretty much everybody. So that's a good thing to know is I think there's a certain type who often become creative sorts. But one of the things that we sometimes can get caught on is the idea that somehow we're going to be in charge of this whole process and we're going to, be able to do something about this. And if only I had changed this one thing, then it would have made the total difference. And letting go that there's a whole lot of things that are completely without of your control. And that includes, is the agent that you spent months researching this query letter for, did she just break up with her boyfriend, Bob, and the main character in your story is named Bob, and therefore as soon as she reads that, she thinks, screw that, screw Bob, I hate that guy. And you, of course, have no way of knowing that because she hasn't listed on her website, please don't name anyone Bob. So you have the problem that someone rejects your book, which has absolutely nothing to do with anything to do other than the fact that you named a character after someone that they don't like. Or you could be sending your query, and again, you may not know, but maybe they just came back from a huge conference and they're buried under requests. And so they're hardly looking at their query pile or just really quickly skimming through it. It could be that they just signed another book that has Amazon characters that might be completely different, right? So they just signed Lisa Voisin's book, which is a YA historical where a character from this time period has gone back in time to the Amazon, which is nothing at all like Alyssa's book. But just because they basically just signed an Amazon book, they may not be looking for one. So those are all things that you absolutely can't control. So I think that is something to keep in mind. Alyssa put it in the chat window, so I'd be interested for people to respond to that if they have a particular strategy. For me, just so people know, I was sending things out in batches of 5 because that would give me an opportunity to sort of change something. So if I ended up back getting an interesting response, I could sort of change up my query, or if I suddenly realized I wanted to do a different query, I could sort of change it up. I do know that some people have done 2 different styles of query letter to see if they get more response from one or another. So they send out 5 query letter A, and then they send out 5 query letter B to try and see, like, is it a case of they get more response to A versus B? Of course, the problem that you have is there's no control group. So you have no way of knowing whether it's the query letter or if you just sent it to people who are more interested in one or another. So that might happen. The other thing that I would take a look at is someone wrote, oh, actually it was Alyssa, do you have a better chance with a less experienced agent? Typically you will. And the reason is they don't have a full roust of writers already working for them and with them. So for example, when I signed with my first agent, Rachel Coyne, I was the 3rd person that she signed. So at that time, she was a brand new baby agent, and she was desperately looking because, again, she wasn't going to make money until she sold books. So she was desperately looking for books to sell. And when I look back on it, in particular, my query letter was nothing to write home about. Like it wasn't wrong, but it wasn't certainly when you talk about, is it grabby enough? Does it have that? Like, it was a just the facts, ma'am kind of query letter. And my book, actually, she did an editorial pass with me. In retrospect, do I think that book was as ready as it could be? Probably not. But I was lucky enough to catch her at a time when she was really looking and she really liked that and she felt that would be something she could sell. So she spent a bit more time. But if I did that, I would look at a less experienced agent who was with an established agency. So again, Rachel, who I went with at that time, was at the Don Moss agency. So I knew that Don and the other agents that worked there had years and years of experience. And in fact, we're going to help her when she went out to start trying to sell things. So for example, if people are wondering who is new, one is just to keep an eye. I get that free Publishers weekly newsletter. It's free. I don't sign up for the paid service. I get the free one, but they often will list so-and-so as a new agent at XYZ firm. And then that is a good way to do it. Or if you look through their website, you'll sometimes see they'll be listed maybe as an assistant agent or something like that. That's going to be someone who's a little bit lower down on the food chain in terms of that, but might be a lot more willing to look at things, and that is a good person to target. Often conferences are bringing in younger agents because they're desperately looking to, again, build their list, so they're a little bit more active and involved in that. So that can be a good thing there. So I would keep an eye on that. So you can't control everything. I was talking about rejection. Be nice to yourself. Again, these are general coping strategies, but don't get caught up in, sort of feeling guilty or terrible about yourself. So make sure that you're spending time to do that. This is where things like this is really useful. I don't know how many people here are members of the Greater Vancouver Writers Association. But one of the things that they do in their monthly meetings is they have, I think they're called chocolades. But basically people, raise their hand and they'll do something like, I sent out and got 4 rejections this week. And then they get a piece of chocolate for having done that. And the idea is that we're trying to celebrate the fact that they put themselves out there and that they made that effort and they did all of that. So that can be a really good way to sort of remind yourself that it's okay. I do know a couple writing groups where they get together once a month at a bar and everyone brings in their rejection letters, and whoever either got the most and or I don't know if I want to say by the best, I mean the worst rejection letter, doesn't have to pay for dinner. So the other people all chip in and pay for that. So that can be a nice way to do it. Girlfriends and I used to get together back when I had a barbecue, and we would sit around and drink wine, and we would sort of set the rejection letters on fire. We'd print them out and burn them up. So feel free to, create voodoo dolls or whatever it is that kind of gets you through that period of time, but sort of remembering to have fun with it in some way, shape, or form, which is useful. Again, whenever dealing with stress, making sure that you're focusing on physical stuff too, like are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating properly? Are you getting out, doing some walking, getting some exercise? You don't want to turn into a house troll, which is really easy to do, where you're stalking your inbox constantly and waiting and waiting and waiting. So some kind of thing to sort of get yourself out and moving is really useful. And it's okay to not be okay. Like, I think it's important to say it's okay if it gets you down and gets you discouraged. I think that is normal, but I do think you want to make sure that you're monitoring yourself and you're keeping an eye on things, that you're not actually slipping into depression. And depression is something that a lot of writers do struggle with. So if you find that, and there's tons of online surveys that you can take that will be like, am I depressed? That will sort of help you look at things. But it's things like if you're sleeping way too much or not sleeping at all, if you've had changes in your food habits, if you find that you're, can't get excited about anything, that's a big one. And here's an interesting thing that, of course, now Donna has gotten me interested in all sort of psychosocial kinds of studies and various things. But I started looking up what's the kind of secret behind successful people. And there was a psychologist, Dan Simonton, who wrote a book called On the Origins of Genius. And he wrote, and this is the worst sentence ever, I have to tell you, creativity is a probabilistic consequence of productivity. Which is really just a way overly fancy way of saying successful people produce more.
Probabilistic? Probabilistic?
Yeah.
That's not even a word.
So basically the only way to keep going is you probably will have to fail more. Like, I don't know how many of you have read Stephen King's On Writing. But one of the things he talks about is that, he had a nail in his bedroom and he would just spear each of those rejection letters onto that nail. And he took kind of a lot of pride in that. But if he had given up, that certainly wouldn't have been a part of his success. And then one of the other things that they talk about that they think it's really interesting is having the idea of having purpose. And this is why they talk about people who deal with a lot of failing, which is basically a lot of this kind of stuff, is the idea of, do you see a purpose behind it other than just the outcome? Like, I want to publish a book, but like, why is it that this is a story that you want to tell? What is it important about it? Why do you like being a writer? What are those kind of things that you can do that will help you be a little bit more flexible when things don't go your way? Right. So that comes from Lisa McLeod, and she does performance leadership stuff with business leaders. But she showed basically that individuals who have a clearly stated purpose dramatically outperform those who don't. So for example, if 2 people are selling a mechanical part that helps a train to slow, one will bounce back for rejection and sell more product, who whether is that the guy who wants a revenue goal or whether it's a guy who sees every sale as an opportunity to save lives. So in typical, the people who see the focus and having a purpose to what they're doing versus just I'll make more money are the people who tend to bounce back a little bit better. I'm going to put an article in here, and this is a free, just so you know, it's by my agent. So I might be a little bit biased, but she wrote a great article that I enjoy. There it goes. Questions that you were too afraid to ask agents. And as an agent, she's answering those. So one, she has a great sense of humor, so it's kind of fun to read anyway. But strangely enough, it was this article that made me convinced that I wanted her as my agent. And it was because when I read the article, I just had a sense that she and I were going to get along really, really well. And I'll be curious, those of you who know me, if you read that article, if you're like, and that is why she chose Barbara Powell, that would definitely be a part of it. And that, I think, is one of the last things I wanted to leave you guys with, is that idea that in the process of searching for an agent, it feels like anyone who loves me, I will love. And just as that's not particularly attractive in a romantic relationship, you're not looking for that in an agent relationship. You're really looking for someone who loves your work and is excited for your work and is going to do the best work for you. And it's worth continuing to search for that. Or it's worthwhile deciding at some point that maybe you don't want to search for an agent and you want to go indie. And that's certainly a very valid choice and certainly makes a lot of sense. In a market that is really hard. I think it's often harder to get an agent than it is to get a publishing deal, to be honest. All right. And if people have questions, you can see Leslie wrote in the chat window that she's going to interview her agent friend. So if that is happening, so yeah, make sure if people have any questions that you're firing those off to Leslie. That's a good one to do that. Cynthia's going indie. So we're going to have some talks about that. I'm excited for you. And if you haven't connected with Mary Ann, you should, because she's gone indie as well. And she might have for some interesting things. And I'm curious, does anyone else have any questions? We have just a couple minutes left. Leslie.
I've already asked this before, but I'm just going to ask it again in case other people didn't hear this question. How and when do you decide that it's time to quit querying?
This is such a hard thing. So I'm going to separate it into two parts. So one, do you need to take a break? Which sometimes is part of what it is. So you might need to take a break because you're just at your wit's end, or you need some more time to relook at your query and see if you need to rework it, all those kinds of things. The second one is, depending what you're getting. So if you're getting full and partial requests and people are coming back and they like certain things but not something else, I would tell you to hang in the game because you've got something that is working. If you're getting kind of pretty much nothing but auto, thank you so much for your time, there's something that's not working, and that might be your query, or it might be you just have a book at the wrong time and place. So for example, there was a time there where dystopian was like, forget it, you couldn't sell it for love or money just about, but it's now starting to cycle back. So what I think you are seeing now is some people who might have queried a dystopian novel who stopped querying because nobody was doing anything, who are now finding there are people who are interested and wanting to take a look at it. So I would encourage people to potentially think about whether or not they want to just hang on. So you may be querying a book that's just at not a great time. Or put it aside, write something else, and then go back and read your book, because I think sometimes the only thing that you can really do is give yourself distance. Not sure if anyone else has thoughts on when they decide to stop querying. Sometimes it's just a personal choice of, I'm just done. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm ready to get this book out there, and I just don't care. Or they've read more about the indie thing and they suddenly realize, like, you know what, I think that is the way that I want to go, and I'm just going to go that route and do it in a different way. So I think that's also totally legit. So I think at some point it is a personal thing. Marianne?
Can I just speak to that? Oh, good timing, Bear. I'm going to sneeze.
We moved her to tears. She was talking about it.
The hay fever won't let up this year. So just on that point, Eileen, about just not being able to take it anymore. I haven't queried for years, but I was doing a fair bit of it back when, and I never, even after people had read partials or samples of my work, I was getting very consistent feedback, which is that this is really well written, but it's not for us. And I couldn't get any more information about it. So I couldn't change or improve my writing based on the feedback that I was getting. And I also, and I don't know whether this was a gut feeling, but I kind of came to the conclusion that it had to do with the marketability of particular niches. Mm-hmm. And I'd been immersing myself in studying indie publishing and book marketing for some time in parallel with all of that, and come to the conclusion that indie publishing and the whole indie book marketing world allows for more niche marketing than the bigger publishers are capable or willing to pursue. And so based on the manuscripts that I had accumulated, I had a better chance of finding my readers, however small a group that might be, if I went it alone, because nobody was going to understand that or be as invested in finding those readers as I was. That was one criterion. And two, I just had gotten to the point where I thought, I can't stand any more wheels spinning. I need forward motion. Even though 4 books in, I'm still not selling books, but I am moving forward. Like I have a big plan and I'm in control of it. And I sometimes push really hard without necessarily seeing the results that I would wish to see. But I know that every ounce of effort that I put into the process is moving me toward my end goals, whatever those might be.
And I think that's a huge part of it for a reason a lot of people go indie. One is it's actually an option now, which it didn't used to be. Like it used to be, you could go indie, but you were that person driving around with a box of books in your trunk and making all your relatives buy them. And now that, that's not the way that books are necessarily marketed and sold, you have so many more options than you did before. And the truth of the matter is traditional publishing, so little is in your control as an author. Which is both good and bad. Like there's someone else doing a marketing plan, there's someone else doing a cover, but all of that's out of your control. So it can be quite nice to take that back and to be in the driver's seat with that.
In retrospect, I wish I had been less careful and less paranoid and jumped on the indie bandwagon years, like 4 or 5 years earlier than I did. Because the market changed as it became a more valid option and more people and more books were out there crowding the market. Because some of the people that got in earlier were able to kind of catch that wave. And now it's increasingly more difficult, not just for indies, but for everybody, because the entire marketplace has changed. Amazon's changed everything. Indie authors have changed things. And there's nothing anybody can do about that now.
And it will change again.
Write more books and make more noise, and that's a little sad and tedious, but it's the reality that we live with today. So I don't know there are always going to be certain advantages to traditional publishing that the indie world hasn't quite compensated for yet. And one of those is certain distribution channels, and the other is reaching foreign language markets. Those two things are really, really tough.
And the advance check. So, and on that, we are coming up at our 10 o'clock. So I am going to end us out for the night, or the day, I should say. It just feels like night because it's so dark out there. And remind people that I will be back next week. And I had gotten a request, but I wanted some more time to pull it together, which is talking about writing sequels. and some things to keep in mind. So if people have any thoughts or questions specifically on that, let me know. But I'm going to be working on that over the next week, and I will have that for us then. So until then, everyone, take care, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.